Ethan Carter had never imagined that a quiet suburban life could be disrupted by petty power plays and bureaucratic overreach. A decorated military veteran turned dedicated city official, Ethan had found solace in his charming two-story home tucked away on a leafy cul-de-sac. More than just a house, his property included a winding, privately owned trail, a narrow ribbon of woodland that meandered through tall pines and rustling oaks. This trail wasn't merely a path. It was Ethan's sanctuary, a place where he could clear his mind, recall cherished memories of his service, and plan a future where community and nature coexisted in harmony. Ethan's home, with its meticulously maintained garden and a porch that welcomed both neighbors in moments of quiet reflection, stood as a testament to his commitment to order and beauty. Every brick, every blade of grass, was a part of the legacy he'd built with hard work and honor. Yet, the serene rhythm of his days was about to be shattered by an unexpected force. The HOA and its undisputed queen of entitlement, Karen. Karen wasn't always a figure of scorn in the neighborhood, but since she assumed the role of HOA president, her personality had morphed into something unrecognizable. With a permanent air of superiority and an obsession with trivial regulations, she had become the enforcer of a litany of arbitrary rules. Her penchant for micromanagement and her willingness to levy fines for the most minute infractions had already left several residents trembling. Rumors swirled of neighbors who'd been penalized for anything from the hue of their mailboxes to the brightness of their garden lights. And now, her eyes had turned to Ethan's beloved property. It started innocently enough. One breezy autumn afternoon, as golden sunlight filtered through the trees, Ethan noticed a notice pinned to his front door. In crisp, official-looking script it read, "Final warning, violation of community aesthetics." The alleged offense? His private trail was inconsistent with HOA-approved landscaping standards. Ethan blinked in disbelief. The trail, which bordered his property and led into a secluded wooded area, had always been maintained according to his own standards, and more importantly, it was clearly marked as private property. No city ordinance or local zoning code had ever given the HOA jurisdiction over it. Yet Karen's notice spoke as if it were gospel. Determined not to be bullied, Ethan decided to approach the situation with the calm, measured determination he'd honed over years of service. But fate intervened that very evening when he encountered Karen herself. Standing in the twilight near the entrance to his driveway, she looked every bit the self-assured ruler of her tiny domain. With arms crossed and a faint, condescending smile, she reiterated her demands. The trail needed immediate modification to meet the HOA's strict and, frankly, nonsensical guidelines. Ethan's heart pounded as he realized that this was no minor misunderstanding. It was an overt challenge to his rights and his cherished way of life. Ethan, ever respectful yet resolute, explained that his property was clearly demarcated as private and that he had every right to manage his own land. Karen's eyes narrowed. "You don't understand," she snapped, her tone dripping with entitlement. "We're all part of this community, and you're undermining our standards. We have rules for a reason." The conversation escalated quickly from a polite exchange to a battle of wills. Neighbors peered from behind curtains, anxious to witness yet another clash between the bureaucrat and the free-spirited homeowner. In that fraught moment, the seed of conflict was planted. Ethan knew that Karen's interpretation of community rules was more about control than genuine concern for aesthetics or safety. And so, as dusk turned to night, Ethan resolved to stand his ground. His private trail was his refuge, a symbol of his independence, and a living reminder of his commitment to preserving a piece of nature amid an increasingly regulated world. Thus began the saga of a man who would soon find himself at war with an HOA that had lost its way, a war not just of property lines and regulations, but of principle and personal freedom. The morning after Ethan's fateful encounter, he awoke to a new and unwelcome reality. Taped squarely to his front door was an envelope bearing the official seal of the HOA. With a quick, sinking feeling in his gut, he opened it to discover a $750 fine, accompanied by a formal letter alleging severe noncompliance with community aesthetic standards. The letter, written in stilted legalese, laid out a series of convoluted arguments about how his trail's natural design disrupted the HOA's vision of uniform beauty. Karen's signature was unmistakable. Every word reeked of entitlement. Outside, Karen made her presence known in full display. Leaning casually against a perfectly trimmed hedge, she addressed Ethan with a smug certainty. "The rules apply to everyone, Ethan," she declared, her voice echoing in the quiet morning air. "If you don't comply, we'll have no choice but to escalate." Her tone left no room for debate. Yet, as a city official, Ethan was not one to be bullied by flimsy threats. Inside, as he perused the fine and the accompanying documents, Ethan felt the stirrings of indignation. He recalled local ordinances, property rights, and, most importantly, his own clear title to the land. "This is nothing more than a power play," he muttered to himself. Resolute, he set about documenting every detail. Photos of the trail, copies of property deeds, and even the mundane sign marking the beginning of his private path were all meticulously archived. Later that day, Ethan took his concerns to the local zoning office. With calm authority, he explained that the HOA had no jurisdiction over his property, especially not the privately owned trail that snaked along the natural edge of his land. His arguments were backed by local statutes, and the official he spoke to assured him that the matter would be reviewed promptly. But Karen was not done. Unwilling to accept any challenge to her power, she immediately escalated the situation. Within hours, Ethan's neighborhood was buzzing with activity. Anonymous phone calls reached the local inspector's office, and inspectors soon began showing up at his property. They combed through his meticulously cared-for trail, clipboard in hand, searching for a violation that simply did not exist. As the inspectors wandered the property, Karen loomed in the background, a picture of self-satisfied authority. "It's for the good of the community," she insisted to anyone who would listen, as though the invasion of privacy and the sudden disruption of Ethan's daily routine were all for a noble cause. Yet, beneath her veneer of righteousness lay a clear message. Ethan must submit or face further consequences. Ethan, bolstered by the support of local law and his own unwavering resolve, refused to cave in. Each inspector's visit only strengthened his determination to expose the absurdity of the HOA's actions. He began to prepare a formal response, citing every legal precedent and municipal regulation that affirmed his right to manage his own property as he saw fit. And while Karen strutted about with an air of entitlement, Ethan quietly assembled his evidence, ready to challenge every baseless fine and every arbitrary warning. By the close of day, the tension in the neighborhood had reached a fever pitch. Whispers filled the streets, with neighbors wondering if they too would become targets of the HOA's overzealous enforcement. But for Ethan, this was not just about a fine. It was about reclaiming his autonomy and standing up to an institution that had strayed far from its intended purpose. In that first major power move, Karen had unwittingly united the community in silent support of Ethan's right to his own property. And as he sat down at his kitchen table that evening, poring over legal documents and formulating his next steps, Ethan knew that this was only the beginning of a long, hard-fought battle against the tyranny of rules gone mad. When Karen's initial forays into power proved ineffective against Ethan's calm defiance, her tactics grew ever more aggressive. Early on a misty morning, as Ethan stepped out to survey the trail with renewed resolve, he noticed small changes that hadn't been there before. Crude warning markers planted along the edges of his property, hastily painted symbols that signified a violation only to those in Karen's inner circle. It was as though the HOA was sending a message, one of intimidation and control. Karen's next move came in the form of a barrage of official letters that piled up in Ethan's mailbox over the following days. Each notice cited a new infraction, imaginary ones really. One letter accused him of improper natural landscaping, for allowing wildflowers to grow near the trail. Another claimed that the irregular curve of the path endangered the overall visual symmetry of the community. And then came the most chilling, a threat of property seizure if he did not immediately rectify the so-called violations. At first, Ethan dismissed these charges as baseless charades. He had spent hours poring over property records and local ordinances, which clearly stated that his private trail was under his sole jurisdiction. But as the threats mounted and the fines became more frequent, Ethan realized that there was something far more sinister at work: corruption within the HOA itself. Late one evening, after a particularly trying day filled with yet another unsolicited visit from an inspector armed with a notepad and a rigid interpretation of non-existent codes, Ethan decided to dig deeper. Over cups of strong coffee and long hours spent combing through HOA meeting minutes, he discovered disturbing patterns. Several long-time residents had been warned, in secret, whenever they dared to question Karen's edicts. A few board members, previously silent on matters of fairness, began offering subtle hints that Karen was using HOA funds for her personal whims, money that was meant for community improvements, funneled instead into expensive lunches and private vacations. The evidence was damning. One board member, speaking in hushed tones during a chance encounter at a local diner, confided that fines mysteriously disappeared from the accounts whenever large sums were needed for a personal purchase. "She controls everything," the neighbor whispered. "Nobody dares stand up to her." Ethan's investigative instincts kicked in. He began setting up discreet cameras along key vantage points of his property and the trail. Every suspicious encounter was recorded. Every conversation with a reluctant neighbor was documented. Ethan wasn't just defending his property anymore. He was uncovering a web of deceit that threatened the integrity of the entire community. During one tense evening, as the wind howled outside and shadows danced along the edges of his garden, Ethan discovered that even his closest neighbors had been fearful of speaking out. Yet, in private, many confessed that they had seen Karen bend rules for her benefit, and that her actions were designed to cement her power rather than maintain community standards. Ethan's resolve hardened. With the evidence mounting, he quietly began to plan his counterattack. He compiled digital files, printed copies of municipal regulations, and prepared statements that exposed the corruption simmering beneath the surface of the HOA. His intention was clear. Not only would he defend his private trail, but he would also dismantle the entire oppressive system that Karen had built around herself. As days turned into weeks, the conflict escalated. Karen's tactics became more aggressive, and the language in her notices grew increasingly ominous. Threats of eviction and legal action were now commonplace, and she even hinted that noncompliance could result in law enforcement intervention. Yet, each move only served to galvanize Ethan's determination. With every new document that landed on his doorstep, he found more proof of impropriety, and with every inspector's visit, he grew more confident in the righteousness of his cause. In quiet defiance, Ethan continued his daily patrol of the trail, camera in hand, eyes open for any sign of further injustice. The battle lines had been drawn, and it was clear that Karen and her cronies would stop at nothing to enforce their warped vision of community order. But Ethan, armed with the truth and backed by a growing number of disillusioned neighbors, was ready to expose every illegal move in the HOA's playbook. As summer turned to early fall, Karen's campaign of intimidation took a dramatic and dangerous turn. One chilly morning, Ethan awoke to an alarming sight. Heavy machinery was parked at the edge of his property. Bulldozers and diggers, their engines rumbling ominously, had been deployed to improve the community infrastructure by widening the trail. Karen's justification was flimsy at best, a sudden claim that the HOA had secured funds for expanding sidewalks to accommodate an influx of new residents. But Ethan knew better. This was not a community improvement. It was a hostile takeover of his private land. Ethan rushed outside as workers began marking boundaries with bright yellow tape. The intrusion felt invasive, an outright act of aggression. "Stop this immediately," he shouted, his voice echoing over the din of machinery. Karen emerged from a hastily convened group of board members, her eyes cold and unyielding. "You're in violation of HOA orders," she declared. "This is for the benefit of the entire community." Her words, however, rang hollow to Ethan, who could see that the work was being done without any legal permits or due process. Without hesitation, Ethan brandished a folder thick with legal documents, copies of property deeds, zoning laws, and evidence of the HOA's overreach. In a move that stunned the gathered crowd of onlookers, he calmly laid out the evidence on a portable table in front of the impromptu construction site. "This is my property, and my trail is private," he announced, his tone firm and measured. "Your orders have no legal basis, and you're breaking the law." The silence that followed was palpable. Neighbors, previously too timid to speak out, began murmuring in agreement. Some captured the scene on their smartphones, their faces lit with a mixture of shock and vindication. A few board members exchanged nervous glances, their loyalty to Karen wavering under the weight of undeniable facts. Karen's response was to double down on her tactics. "You'll regret defying the HOA," she hissed, stepping closer to Ethan. "We have inspectors and legal counsel ready to enforce compliance." Yet as she spoke, Ethan's calm defiance only grew. He responded by citing municipal regulations and reminding everyone present that a homeowners association did not have the power to seize private property or shut off utilities without proper authority. The confrontation quickly escalated into a public spectacle. Some neighbors, emboldened by Ethan's courage, voiced support. "We want our rights too." And "Karen, you're overstepping every boundary." The HOA's power, once absolute in Karen's eyes, began to crumble under the scrutiny of a community united by common sense and justice. Later that day, as the media arrived on the scene following word of mouth on social media, Ethan was seen calmly negotiating with local officials. The authorities promised to review the HOA's actions immediately. Karen, red-faced and rattled, could only watch as the construction halted and her plans unraveled. In that moment, the tide had begun to turn. Ethan's strategic use of legal documentation and public confrontation had not only halted the unwarranted construction, but it also inspired a collective courage among the residents. The oppressive atmosphere that Karen had fostered was now cracking, and the community was starting to see that their voices, when united, could challenge even the most arrogant figures. As the day drew to a close, Ethan returned to his home with a sense of cautious optimism. He knew the battle was far from over, yet he had delivered a powerful blow to the HOA's overreach. In the echo of that confrontation, the message was clear. When a community stands together and one man refuses to back down, even the most entrenched abuses of power can be exposed and defeated. With the community rallying around Ethan and local officials beginning to question the legality of the HOA's actions, Karen's desperation grew palpable. In a last-ditch effort to salvage her crumbling authority, she resorted to tactics that would forever mark her downfall. One brisk morning, as Ethan was enjoying a rare moment of peace on his porch, the tranquility was shattered by the sound of sirens and raised voices outside. Karen had called the police, this time alleging that Ethan's porch lights and the natural glow of his trail were a public disturbance, threatening the safety and order of the neighborhood. The police arrived, their uniforms crisp and their expressions skeptical, as they attempted to mediate yet another of Karen's fabricated infractions. Ethan, calmly presenting his city official badge and a stack of documented evidence, explained the situation in detail. The officers exchanged glances, clearly frustrated by what they deemed a misuse of their time. But Karen's tactics did not stop there. In a move that would prove her ultimate undoing, she covertly hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on Ethan, hoping to find some scandal that could discredit him once and for all. Late one night, as Ethan reviewed the latest developments in his ongoing legal battle, a flicker on his security camera caught his eye. The footage revealed a shadowy figure lurking near his garage, clearly attempting to gain unauthorized entry. Ethan's pulse quickened as he rewound the tape, catching a glimpse of a badge and a familiar figure in the background. A known associate of Karen's, dressed in nondescript clothing, but unmistakably there to spy on him. Armed with this new evidence, Ethan knew it was time to act. At the next HOA meeting, a crowded, tense gathering held in the community center, Ethan took the floor. With a quiet yet unyielding voice, he presented the damning video evidence on a projector screen for all to see. The room, filled with anxious homeowners and a few reluctant board members, fell into stunned silence as the footage played out. Karen's plot to sabotage his reputation was laid bare, and the evidence was irrefutable. "You see," Ethan began, his voice resonant and calm, "this isn't about a misplaced light or a crooked trail. This is about abuse of power, illegal surveillance, and an outright disregard for our rights as property owners." His words were met with murmurs of agreement from the crowd. Even those who had once supported the HOA's stringent measures now looked on with dismay as Karen's desperate measures were exposed for what they were: illegal and unethical attempts at control. Karen's face drained of color as she attempted to interject, but the mounting evidence and the community's shifting sentiment left her floundering. The local police, now aware of her repeated attempts to misuse law enforcement, assured Ethan that they would investigate the matter further. Moreover, a few board members, emboldened by Ethan's clarity and the undeniable proof, began questioning her authority openly. In the midst of the chaos, Karen's private investigator was identified as a hired hand for the HOA. The irony was not lost on the gathered residents, a self-proclaimed enforcer of rules, now caught spying on a law-abiding citizen. The meeting ended with Karen's voice reduced to whispers and the collective realization that her days of unchecked authority were numbered. Ethan left the meeting to a chorus of supportive claps and grateful nods from his neighbors. His carefully documented campaign of resistance had reached a fever pitch, and Karen's final, desperate moves had only sealed her fate. The once imposing figure of entitlement was now exposed as a desperate, manipulative force whose actions were not only unjust but illegal. And with that, the final act of her tyranny was set in motion. In the days that followed the explosive HOA meeting, the community's mood shifted dramatically. What had once been a subdued neighborhood now buzzed with a palpable energy. Residents felt emboldened to stand up for their rights and demand accountability. Rumors flew fast and furious, and soon enough, the once feared HOA was facing unprecedented public scrutiny. Karen's downfall was swift and uncompromising. In a surprising turn of events, a special meeting was convened by a coalition of concerned homeowners. With Ethan at the helm of the movement, the vote to remove Karen from her position as HOA president passed with overwhelming support. The very board members who had once cowered under her thumb began to distance themselves, many of them citing ethical concerns and the mounting evidence of mismanagement. Karen, who had so long carried herself with a veneer of invincibility, now found herself isolated. As word of her misdeeds spread beyond the confines of the neighborhood, reaching local news outlets and even the city council, pressure mounted for a full-scale investigation into the HOA's practices. The city, already alerted by Ethan's persistent efforts and the documented evidence of illegal activities, launched an inquiry into the organization's financial records and the legitimacy of its enforcement actions. Within days, the HOA's facade began to crumble. The fines and penalties that Karen had levied without justification were declared null and void by local authorities. The financial misappropriations she had long hidden were brought to light, prompting several board members to resign in protest. In a dramatic twist, Karen's own house was placed on the market as a consequence of her tarnished reputation and the subsequent legal actions taken by the community. Ethan, meanwhile, found himself at the center of a burgeoning movement for change. Homeowners who had once lived in fear of arbitrary fines and invasive inspections now celebrated the triumph of truth and justice. Public meetings were held in which neighbors discussed plans for reformed community guidelines, ones that respected individual rights and adhered to actual legal standards. The transformation was nothing short of revolutionary. One sunny afternoon, as Ethan sat on his well-lit porch savoring a quiet cup of coffee, he reflected on the journey that had led him here. His private trail, once the battleground of an unjust war, now symbolized the resilience of a community united in purpose. The victory was bittersweet. There had been long nights of worry and relentless battles with an oppressive system. But it was also a victory for democracy and the rule of law. For Karen, there was no room for redemption. The public humiliation, the legal repercussions, and the systematic dismantling of her authority left her with few options. Forced to resign and retreat from the neighborhood she had so arrogantly sought to control, she became a cautionary tale of entitlement gone awry. In the eyes of the community, Her downfall was not merely a personal defeat, but a triumph for every homeowner who had ever felt silenced by arbitrary rules. As the HOA collapsed under the weight of its own corruption, and the city took decisive legal action against those involved, Ethan's steadfast stand had proven that one person's courage could spark a revolution. The community was healing, and the dark days of arbitrary fines and invasive tactics were finally drawing to a close. With the community rallying and the scandal fully exposed, the legal system moved swiftly. City officials imposed hefty fines on the HOA for the repeated abuse of power and the illegal enforcement of non-existent regulations. A formal investigation was launched, and as evidence mounted, several board members faced legal scrutiny for their roles in enabling Karen's overreach. Ethan assisted his neighbors in filing a class action lawsuit against the HOA, ensuring that those affected received restitution for the financial and emotional stress inflicted upon them. The case quickly gained local media attention, and what began as a personal battle had transformed into a landmark legal action against community mismanagement. Local law firms, bolstered by the mountain of evidence Ethan had compiled, took up the case with vigor, while independent auditors examined the HOA's financial records. The legal consequences for the HOA were severe. Not only was the organization fined beyond measure, but regulatory bodies also ordered its immediate dissolution. In its place, a new committee, composed of residents committed to fairness and transparency, was established to draft sensible, legally sound guidelines that respected property rights while fostering a spirit of neighborly cooperation. Ethan's final power move came during a televised city council meeting, where he presented a comprehensive report on the HOA's misconduct. His clear, articulate presentation of the facts resonated with council members and citizens alike. With his steady resolve and undeniable evidence, Ethan helped secure a decision that not only penalized the corrupt practices of the former HOA, but also set a precedent for how community organizations should operate. As the dust settled and the legal battles wound down, the former HOA was relegated to a cautionary chapter in the neighborhood's history, a stark reminder that no one, regardless of title or position, was above the law. In the aftermath of the legal and public reckoning, Karen's personal life unraveled as fast as her professional empire. The fallout was swift. Her reputation, once bolstered by a facade of authority, lay in tatters. Neighbors who had once tiptoed around her now openly expressed their disdain, and the media's coverage of her scandalous actions left little room for privacy. Within weeks, Karen was forced to leave her residence under the weight of legal judgments and mounting debts. Her car, a once proud symbol of her status, was repossessed. The personal cost was staggering. Her husband, unable to withstand the constant barrage of negative publicity and internal strife, filed for divorce. Public appearances became a source of humiliation as she was recognized not as a leader, but as the poster child for entitlement and abuse of power. One afternoon, as Ethan strolled through the neighborhood, he glimpsed Karen in a moment of unexpected irony. There she was, in a modest outfit and unassuming posture, employed as an assistant property manager for yet another HOA, an organization that prided itself on strict adherence to rules. The sight was a bitter twist of fate. Ethan paused, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I hope you like following the rules," he murmured under his breath. The poetic justice of it all was not lost on the community. Former supporters of the oppressive system exchanged glances of disbelief at how quickly the mighty had fallen. Karen's personal downfall was a testament to the fact that entitlement, no matter how deeply entrenched, cannot stand up to truth and accountability forever. In private moments, Ethan reflected on the transformation that had taken place. The once intimidating figure of Karen was now a living example of what happens when power is abused. Her story served as a reminder that even those who seek to control every facet of a community must eventually answer for their actions. In the quiet weeks that followed the collapse of the corrupt HOA, the neighborhood slowly returned to a state of calm. Life resumed its natural rhythm. Children played in the yards, neighbors exchanged friendly greetings over freshly painted fences, and Ethan's private trail, now a symbol of resistance and reclaimed freedom, became a haven for reflection and community walks. Ethan often found himself sitting on his porch in the early evenings, watching as the golden light bathed the street in warmth. His home, once the epicenter of a fierce battle, now radiated peace. Occasional laughter and conversation from passing neighbors affirmed that the dark days of authoritarian overreach were behind them. In place of fear and mistrust, a new sense of camaraderie had taken root. At one community potluck held in the local park, someone couldn't resist a playful jab. As Ethan laughed with a group of neighbors, a volunteer, grinning mischievously, handed him an old, crumpled paper mimicking an HOA violation notice. The absurdity of it all sparked a ripple of laughter throughout the gathering. "They really tried," Ethan remarked with a twinkle in his eye, the final mic drop of a long and arduous struggle. In that light-hearted moment, the neighborhood celebrated more than just the downfall of an overbearing system. They celebrated the triumph of truth, the power of collective action, and the fact that even the mightiest of bullies can be brought low by courage and unity. As dusk settled and the laughter faded into the gentle hum of night, Ethan knew that his fight had set in motion lasting change, a legacy of empowerment and justice for all who valued their freedom. Fade to black.